Next, your topic should be interest your audience and try to focus on people, as they have a say that news is people. So under word running, there are questions for editors to determine the stories. How much will audience care about your stories? How much of the available space is the story worth compared with other stories the newsroom want to run? Second will be good leads. As we know that our news story divided into two parts. One is hard news story, and second will be soft news story. Under the hard news lead, usually we will start our leads with who, what, time, day, place. For the who, we came with immediate ID lead for well-known people such as Barack Obama. Everyone knows who he is. And then delayed ID for not so well-known people, or maybe we can use for local governments. As for future story lead, or also known as soft news lead, usually we will start the lead with description, dialogue, character, anecdote, or personal address. There are rules for both leads, which is keep short and simple, avoid cliché leads, make sure it says something definite. Don't ever start your lead with time, day, place, quotation, or question. Don't editorialize with value judgment or unattributed paraphrases. Don't hide the story more than it's actually worth. Don't bury or miss the real story. Third, stories organize and flow well. How to check? There are 6 steps. First will be look at the lead, determine it uses immediate ID, determine hard news or feature. Second, notice the lead uses immediate ID or delayed ID. Third, look at whether the story contains quotes. Fourth, look for basic details that must be answered. Fifth, ask whether each step in the story is clear. Sixth, ask whether the story moves along at good pace. Fourth, stories don't live with unanswered questions. Why does this happen? This can happen due to carelessness, conflict between trying to be concise and trying to make your story complete. Hence, you also need to try to avoid technical jargon. Under this, they have checklists for it. First, who read the story? What they want to know. 2. What have to be in the story to be complete? Are there any questions a reader would likely ask? Are any intriguing angles introduced, then dropped without explanation? Are all first reference to a person or organization complete? 5th, stories are accurate. What to check? Spelling of names, local addresses, unfamiliar place names, words are 2 words, 1 words or hyphenated, well-known quotations, facts and figures. Avoid inconsistencies. Beware of unwarranted superlatives. Beware horses and urban legends. 6. Stories are objective. How to ensure your stories are objective? First, make sure your story is factual. Stick to things that are provable as opposed to opinions, guesses, rumors, and predictions. Be neutral. Don't editorialize or intrude your stories with your own value judgment. Be fair. Your story should represent all sides evenly. So that means that your story should conclude positive and negative. Be impersonal in style in hard news writing. In hard news writing, we're supposed to follow the inverted pyramid and all those important 5W1H factors. Without the style, it will become a soft news. Next, we will go to MCQ questions. The first question will be, which of the following does not include in macro editing? A will be, story have good leads, are organized and flow well. B, stories are word running. C, stories are legal, ethical, tasteful, and sensitive to the audience. D, stories leave unanswered questions to attract readers. E, stories are accurate and objective. So the answer will be D, stories leave unanswered questions to attract readers. Don't ever leave your stories with unanswered questions. 2. Which of the following are not rules for both leads? A, keep short and simple. B, make sure it says something not definite. C, don't editorialize with value judgment or unattributed paraphrases. D, start with time, day, place, quotation or question. E, don't hype the story more than its actual word. F, bury it or miss the real story when there is not enough spaces. G. Avoid cliché leads. So in this question, actually it contains of more than one answers, which is B. Make sure it says something not definite. D. Start with time, day, place, quotation or questions. And F. Bury it or miss the real story when there is not enough spaces. Our news stories should always ensure that we say things in definite and never ever start with time, day, place, quotation or question without the who factor and what factor. And never try to bury or miss the real story, even though our stories may not contain enough space. As for the third question, which of the following ensures that stories are objective? A. Be factual. Stick to things that are provable as opposed to opinions, guesses, rumors, and prediction. B. Be positive. Don't editorialize or intrude negative sides of the stories. C. Be fair by presents the stories in all sides evenly. D. Be impersonal in style in hard news story. And E. Be professional by using technical words and explanation. So as for these questions, the answer will be A, C, and D. A. We should make sure our story is factual, stick to things that are provable as opposed to opinions, guesses, rumors, and predictions. C. Be fair by present the stories in all sides evenly. And D. Be impersonal in style in hard news stories. That's all. Thank you. Stop.
Pause the video while you...
So about news reporting, a little bit about news reporting, where it's essential of what journalists is all about, where you need to write news which is worth something, and we are the pursuers of the truth, and we are blessed with many kinds of opportunity, which like meet different kinds of people, go anywhere, ask any kind of question, and knowing more than anyone else. So the most important is the eyes of information gathering. So the first I is innovating. Innovating is where you need an idea before you can start writing, where you can borrow, steal, bag, or create it, where most journalists do a little bit more of that. And so what you need to do is keep an idea file, where you keep your ideas that you would like to write in the future. Story clips from other newspapers and magazines where you think is good or may help you in the future as well. And keep clips of good story of you and your colleagues which are already written. Publication from other communities often provide good ideas where you can use it as your own idea in future as well. Review your ideas file frequently and keep a bagger list where you keep contacts of your interviewees or subject where they can be useful in the future event as well. So the second I will be inquiring. Inquiring is where you have to ask yourself what you need to know and move all the way around you, where when you're looking for news you need to search for every single corner or every single sites that you can look at it, and you have to start looking under the rocks, where if you actually encounter something then you need to go somewhere deeper or somewhere which is unpopular. You need to spend more time exhaustively asking questions and hope to be able to write a storytelling that a reader really knows what is happening. So the third I will be interviewing, which is the most important part of the assignment itself, where you need to discover the best available sources. And if you discover sources, start with the easy question and don't ask external questions, which are the hard questions. And you need to learn to keep quiet, just to let your subject talk as much as they can. You need to be spontaneous as well when you're asking questions. You have to be ruthless in the use of anthropology, not of mutual reciprocity, where it actually means in a simple way that try to communicate with your subject just like as a friend. Just be yourself and be brave. So the fourth one will be involving, where the so nowadays more journalists actually involve themselves story directly, where it will help the readers to feel that they are basically part of the story itself. And you need to spend time with a subject and be alert all the times. So the fifth one will be investigating. So when you get investigating, you need to get as much hard evidence as possible. It means that something like files, document, which are you can review it and show this is the real evidence. And you can choose to infiltrate or go undercover, which depends on the interviewing sources. But now more and more journalists pursue hard evidence in the form of mostly, just I just said, documents. So the sixth one will be insisting. So when you insist a subject to cooperate with you, so you need to gain their cooperation, their beliefs, and you need to know the background of the key people and issues ahead of time so that you can convince them to cooperate with you, and they understand the difference between keeping a source confidential, anonymous, unnamed, going off the background or background only. So the seventh one will be indigesting. So you need to go through the notes and mark each note with a topic code. Then you need to mark any usable information with priority code. Then decide which is the most important topic. Then you need to recheck your notes again and make sure all the questions are answered. Then you call your key sources again because they might have new thoughts about the topic itself. And the last one will be the more questions you ask, the more information you might obtain. So the last one is interpreting, where you need to do your research truly and don't let your sources manipulate you, and insist on the reporting fair, accurate, and complete information. Now let's move on to the questions. So the first one will be, which is not one of the ways to you get news ideas? Anyone would like to try? If not, then it will be C, copy others people's ideas directly. So the second one will be what you shouldn't do during the interview of a subject. A, interrupting a subject when they are talking. B, use any sources that you have even though the source might be fake or useless. C, start with a hard question. And D, be spontaneous. This has two answers, which will be B, use any sources that you haven't thought the sources may be fake or useless, or C, start with the hard questions. And the last one will be, which is correct about ingesting. A, write any topics that you feel like it without concern which topic is important. Use any information you have without checking its relevance with the topic. C, go through the notes and mark each topic with a topic code. And D, don't answer all the questions. So the correct answer will be C, going through the notes and mark each question with a topic code. So this will be end of my presentation. Thank you.
Go ahead and pass your sheet around, and just in case anybody did not sign up yet, you do need to sign up for a topic. I did have to make some changes because of these holidays this week. I did send out a notice, or I put an announcement on Moodle that should have sent you a notice that there was about the announcement, and that is, in essence, because this week the holiday was on Tuesday and next week the holiday will be on Wednesday, the student presentations will be after next week. They'll be pushed back a week. So next week is week 3, but presenters from week 3 are now going to do theirs on week 4 because you, first off, you won't be here next week, and secondly, but the students on Tuesday labs, they will be here, so they will present what was just presented to us in their lab next week. So we'll be covering in the labs the information for these first 2 chapters, and thus those of you who have the Art of Editing Chapter 2 and the Art of Editing Chapter 3, yours will be delayed 1 week, so it won't be, well, you won't be here next week, so I guess that should be fairly obvious, but yours will pick up the next week, and then everything else gets pushed back a week. We originally did not have any presentation scheduled for week 15. We now do because everything's being pushed back a week. So I will pass this around. Let's use this as your as our attendance sheet. So just sign underneath your name if you're here, and I will put you under the attendance sheet myself. So we'll start it from over here. Again, if you have not signed up for a presentation, please do that while you're at it. Okay. Oops, I did not turn on the screencast again. Okay, I guess it is. Okay, so today's presenters didn't have the pleasure of listening to this presentation about how they were going to be graded. Therefore, I'm going to have to grade them a little bit easier than I might some other people. Since all of you are going to do a presentation, pay attention to the next few minutes as I go over on what basis you're being graded. I think they did a pretty good job anyway, but as I said, well, they could have been a little bit longer because I did announce to you that your questions and answers could be after your 15 minutes. So they didn't know that, so I can't penalize them for that. So do plan on making your presentation. Again, 10 to 15 minutes, but make sure you cover it fairly well. And I will go over, even though, like I said, I'm going to have to grade them a little bit easier because they didn't hear this. I'm going to use some of what they presented as examples of what maybe you should or should not do, just because they're handy. I don't mean to embarrass them, but it's important that you all understand how to make your presentations. So first of all, each of your presentations is worth up to 4 points, 4 percentage points of your entire grade. And since each of these topics or each of these evaluations are worth 25% of your grade, that means each one's worth 1 point. So that's really easy for me to figure out. So you might get 0.75 on one of these aspects, one of these criterion, or whatever I think it's worth. So there's 4 points and there's 4 criteria to consider. First off, your visual aids. Make sure that your visual aids are clear and easy to understand. When possible, it's good to use graphics. Today's presenters didn't use very many graphics. They had a pleasant background, but not graphics per se. And indeed, it's not necessary to use graphics, but it depends on whether or not it benefits your presentation. Those today probably wouldn't benefit that much from graphics, so actually it probably wouldn't have hurt them even if they hadn't heard this presentation, because theirs were more word-based, and it's hard to think of illustrations or graphics that would be a particular assistance to them. But sometimes, even if they're not highly illustrative of what you're teaching, a few more graphics may make it a little more pleasant to look at, but that wouldn't be a big deal. More important in your PowerPoint is to limit your I have a bug flying around my screen. Get out of here. Is to be careful with how many words you put on a slide. I much rather have more slides with fewer words than lots of words in one slide. Theirs weren't real wordy, but one problem that I find with wordy slides is that you create a cognitive conflict. So if you have lots of words on your PowerPoint slide, then the viewer or the listener, whatever you want to call them, has to decide: do I read the content or do I listen to the speech? They cannot do both at the same time, unless they're exactly the same. If your exact script is on the PowerPoint, then they could do that. But that's also not best practices. We don't want your script on the PowerPoint. We want bullet items. Now, their items were bullet items. Were there too many bullet items? I would say in some there probably were. I would rather have it broke down a little bit with fewer words. Probably, I would try to limit it to, well, let me see. I'm just looking at one right now and counting how many words in this one that looks a little bit wordy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, I would rather limit it to about 25 words. And some of these slides had more like 50. So just make 2 slides out of it, so that while you're presenting on that particular slide, people don't see a lot of other words that they're trying to look at and trying to read at the same time they're listening to you, and have that cognitive conflict. So more slides, fewer words per slide, I would suggest. And with that, in fact, probably more important than that is don't write sentences. Sentences, almost by definition, are adding words that you don't need. So you're almost writing, and this is good practice for you, you're writing headlines. You're writing a headline for each bullet item. You're not writing a sentence. You're not writing your lead, you're writing your headline. You're writing with very few words what you want to talk about, and then that eliminates some words, because by definition that's what a headline does. You're trying to tell a whole story in about 5 words, depending on the size of your type and so forth. So we'll be talking about headline writing later in this course. That in and of itself is a major talent or skill that you have to develop as editors, is how to write a headline. And in headlines, you don't write it like a sentence. You leave out the articles, and the. You try to leave out a lot of adjectives and stuff like that. You're trying to get it down to the basics. You want an active verb, and you want to tell your story in extremely few words, like I say, and that's a challenge. You will get in trouble sometimes because of your headline writing. Like 5 words, you're telling a whole story. So in headline writing, that's a challenge, and it may be also a challenge in your production of a good PowerPoint, is that every idea should take probably no more than 5 words or so. So get it reduced down as short as you can. Obviously, well, this isn't a PowerPoint, but I'm just going down your actual critique sheet. This obviously has more than 25 words on it. And so you may actually be experiencing some cognitive conflict as I'm trying to explain what you should be paying attention to, and here are lots of words. Okay, so you may actually be experiencing what I'm talking about here, cognitive conflict. Do I read or do I listen? And it gets complicated if we put too many words up there. Anyway, this is on Moodle already, so for you to look at. So probably in our case, pay more attention to listening, and you can read it later. What else? Anything else in that one? Okay, that's the main thing with your slides. Make them nice looking. In this case, they used background. They didn't use a lot of, one of them used quite a few graphics, I guess. The other one, not so many. But again, I've seen some people use like multiple graphics on one page and none of them really related to the subject. That's going too far. So you want the slide to look nice. You don't want to put too many graphics on that have hardly any relationship to what you're talking about. So there's kind of a happy medium in there. The content. Again, 1/4 of your grade will be based on your content. And that is probably in this class will be more challenging than the history class that many of you took. Because in this case, I'm limiting you to 15 minutes, and there's no way to cover your subject in 15 minutes. So, by definition, pretty much gives me a chance to deduct points if you don't choose well. If you're not choosing the most interesting or important information from your chapter, you may get some deductions under this because you're not covering the most important content. Now, I'm going to leave a lot of leeway as far as, how I grade this. So you're going to have to get pretty far afield for me to penalize you on this subject, at least based on what you choose to present out of your chapter. It's going to have to be pretty obviously that you did not go over that chapter very well and think very hard about what you presented in order to get deducted in that sense, what you chose to cover out of a chapter. However, there is another area where you could be deducted from. And this probably does relate a little bit to these today's presentations, in that when you present an idea, a concept, are you really going to teach the concept, or are you just going to read the list? If you're going to present it, you should explain it. For example, the anthropological norm of mutual reciprocity. That's a long phrase. What the heck does that mean? The presenter kind of glossed over that pretty fast. I think she said it was conversational. But it actually had more specific meaning than that. I got that from an editor from Rolling Stone magazine. And his example, and maybe she was shy to use his example and couldn't think of another one, but his example was that, and first off, his definition in essence was that as you are conversing with somebody, if you share something with them, they feel some responsibility to share back with you. Now, his example was that he was an editor for Rolling Stone magazine, which means he did a lot of stories with rock groups, with rock stars. And so his example was he was with, a rock star, and he shared his funny, strange example of how he lost his virginity. And thus the rock star felt compelled to share with him how he lost his virginity. And of course, the rock star's loss of virginity was in the story, and his own was not, because he's the writer. So that's kind of he was a very funny presenter, by the way. He was a very funny presenter. But and so that was his example of the mutual, how do you call it again? It's hard to remember the anthropological norm of mutual reciprocity is when you tell something about yourself in a conversational way, they feel compelled to tell you about themselves. And so in some cases it can be rather embarrassing, but only for them, because your embarrassing episode is not in the story. So if you teach a concept, you have to teach the concept. Otherwise, there's no point including the concept in your PowerPoint. And that is a frequent problem of presenters, not just with today's. I would say probably a good share of you made that mistake in your history presentations or other presentations you've made in classes of mine, that you would present a concept and not explain that concept. I still remember a class I took in 1973 or 1972 because the professor taught how you teach a concept. And it applies to not just a classroom, but also as a journalist. How do you get somebody to understand a concept, an important concept that they're not familiar with? He said there's 4 things you have to do, and I think I probably did mention this in your previous class if you took one from me. The first one that most people stop at when they're presenting in my classes is definition. You see it, you have a new concept, and you define it, and that's it. That's all you do. And according to that teacher, that's not enough. If it's a concept with which you are not familiar, the definition is not enough for people to understand. He said the second thing you have to do is illustrate it. Now, that does not necessarily mean a graphic illustration. It could be a verbal illustration, but you have to give an example. So, my example, or actually the Rolling Stone editor's example of the anthropological norm of mutual reciprocity was his story about losing his virginity. That was his example, a rather memorable one, which I also have remembered for decades. So he defined it and he illustrated it verbally, not graphically, what it meant. And that makes it more understandable. Now, the other 2 things that you may have to get to, if you don't think that's enough, one is to compare it to something else that it's similar to, and one is to contrast it with other things that it's different than. So you could, for example, if you're talking about, the presented today was the idea of hard news, soft news, and feature stories. Okay? They were presuming you understand those 3. but actually probably a lot of you don't. So maybe it would have been better to actually do some further illustration or compare and contrasting. Because, for example, somebody asked me for your stories here, they said, well, since we're making these timeless, these are feature stories, right? The answer is no, they're not necessarily feature stories. They could be feature stories, but also hard news can come in a timeless format. As I mentioned, almost all of my stories for my weekly newspaper were written in a timeless fashion because I was competing against a daily newspaper. And so timeless issue-oriented stories are still hard news stories. They could be investigative stories. In fact, I did do investigative stories. And so hard news can come in a timeless format. That is not necessarily equal to a feature story. It has some overlap in how it's presented, but it's not the same. So hard news can come in a timeless format. So can soft news, and so can feature stories. Feature stories almost always are, not always, but if not always, very, very frequently are timeless in nature. Feature stories are. Hard news typically is not timeless in nature. So it's easy to confuse that, but it's not the same thing. So just by eliminating the time factor does not make it a feature story. So if you were trying to explain the difference, you would have to perhaps give some examples in order for people not to be confused by that term. I should perhaps give better examples so you understand a timeless story is not necessarily by definition a feature story. Kind of along with the idea that you only have 15 minutes, under the bullet items here, it includes sharing the most important and interesting information, eliminating the unnecessary and uninteresting information. Graphic illustrations, it's good to use them to help learners' understanding, but there are some topics that are easier to illustrate than other topics. Today's probably didn't need a lot of illustration for understanding purposes, only for artistic purposes. As I mentioned, comparing and contrasting basically are a couple of these bullet items. The third criterion is high quality delivery. It overlaps with your content a little bit in several ways, and it also overlaps somewhat with your PowerPoint, because if you're doing a presentation, if your delivery is somewhat dependent on your PowerPoint. So as you decide what you're going to deliver, your PowerPoint is going to reflect that. So it's nonetheless, I put under high quality delivery some of these that could also be reflected otherwise. Can you excite your listeners with an interesting introduction? Your introduction is like the lead of your news story is your introduction to your presentation. So as you think about your presentation, think about what you can do to get people's interest. Because if you don't get their interest, then they're here looking at the computers, playing games, whatever they're doing. So you need to catch their interest. Enunciate clearly, use proper grammar, emphasize the important concepts in a way that makes them memorable. That overlaps with what I just talked about under content, right? If it's memorable, that's because you've explained it well. You've illustrated it. You've done other things. So that, again, overlaps a little bit with one of the other items, but you want it to be memorable. Explain the concepts clearly. Again, overlaps a little bit. I just taught you how to explain a concept clearly, so that's part of content, part of delivery. Extend eye contact. So we don't want to be reading our presentations. Try to be talking to people, looking at them as much as possible. That is important in order to keep their attention. If you're looking at them, it's hard for them to be playing games at the same time because they're feeling a little bit shy about that. So eye contact is important for attention, but it's also important to make it more conversational. You cannot be expressive if you're reading, or you can be, but it's hard. Let me put it this way. For us amateurs, it's hard to be very expressive if we're reading. An actress or an actor probably could be. They can read their script and sound very very dramatic or whatever it is they need to be sounding like at the time, because they're professionals. But for most of us, if we're reading, we're not being very expressive. And if we're not being very expressive, we're not keeping people's attention. So being expressive is important, and knowing how to emphasize certain things and other things is important. Down here is also elicit verbal feedback. Your presentations are so short, I'm not going to expect you to do a lot of eliciting of feedback during your presentation, but in essence that then overlaps with your questions and answers. In that case, maybe so. Hopefully your presentation has been clear enough that people know how to answer. If you go over too fast, one question was asked today and waited for an answer and nobody had the answer. So that maybe means that the presentation was a little bit fast, or same thing, maybe not enough, maybe covered too many items. It's the same thing, basically. If you try to cover too much and you can't explain it well enough, then nobody's going to answer your questions because they don't remember the answers to it. So it may require even less content than was presented today in order to make it memorable, in order to make it clear and understandable. You may have to be even more selective than the people today were in what they would present. So that's a challenge. How do you feel like you've covered enough to please me? And how do you feel, and how do you do it well to please me? So you're picking your poison, so to speak. If you do it really well, present very well and clearly, and illustrate and all this, am I going to say you didn't cover enough material? Well, I'd say it's probably more likely that I will be impressed by a good presentation that covers less material than I will be by lots of material that is not explained very well. So I would go for the delivery points, because I think that will also get you points in the content, because I'm looking for clear explanations. So maybe a little bit less material still than what you heard today, which seemed like not very much material. I thought they did a good job of deciding what was important, but left some of you scratching your heads as to what some of the things meant. So it maybe was too much for that reason. Energize the audience, and it's nice to be able to end with something memorable as well. So you're trying to catch your attention at the start, you're trying to leave something memorable at the end as to what they'll walk away with. That may be hard in a class like this, but nonetheless that's ideally what you would be doing. Now let me add one other aspect to this. In emphasizing concepts and in keeping people's attention, enunciation and so forth, I may have explained this in the other class, or I may not have taken time to do it, but some of it is simply not, how do I say this? It does relate with being monotone. You don't want to be monotone. You want your tones to go up and down, and also that it also helps to be slow and fast. Slow and fast, high volume, low volume, all help keep people's attention. So, for example, if you have something really important, you can talk louder. This is really important. You need to remember this. And it might also speed you up at the same time you're talking louder, and you're speeding up a little bit because you're showing some excitement about something you say is really important. And so that will get people's attention. Or you could say, this is probably the most important thing you can remember from this class is this. And soften your voice. Either way, going louder or going lower gets people's attention. So think about how you present, and sometimes it's speed, sometimes it's going really, really slowly to get people to listen at every word that you're saying. But sometimes it's getting excited and speaking faster and speaking louder. And sometimes it's speaking softer. But all those things help keep people listening rather than just talking fairly monotone all the time. And it not, if you're reading, that's a big problem. One reason why I don't want you to read is because then you become, almost by definition, monotone, because most of us are not good readers. But even in your fairly conversational presentation, think about how you can make it more interesting with change in your speed, your volume, your everything to try to keep people's attention. The last one is basically it's kind of a miscellaneous subject. It includes a number of things. So did your presentation start on time? Were you ready? Did you give me a copy, a printed copy for me to follow? Have you sent me your electronic copy? So I will finalize your grade when I get back to the office. I'll put a tentative grade here. I want to, again, be able to see that you have sent me your electronic copy by the time I get back to my office, and then record your grade. So, did you send me the electronic copy? Did you create questions? Again, I said, 3 to 5 at maximum. I think both presenters did 3 today, and that was fine. So there's no extra points for doing 4 or 5. But if you think that you're covering your material better with 4 or 5 questions, there's no penalty for that either. So somewhere between 3 and 5 questions. Make sure you ask good questions and make sure you give good answers. I would, for example, I'm not sure what is meant by this answer. Copy other people's ideas directly. That could be debated a little bit. You need to be a little bit careful with that, because I said you could take other people's ideas from other stories. I said you could go to the Star and look for ideas that you could copy. But all your sources are going to be different. All your content will be different, but the idea you stole from somebody else. That's even in the reporting chapter of the crash course, keeping an idea file from other publications. So actually stealing somebody's idea, maybe she meant, when she said copy other people's ideas directly, what does directly mean? See, that word is kind of confusing. You're not stealing there. You're not committing plagiarism if you take somebody's idea, if all the sources are yours, if all the story is yours, you've done all the writing. So be careful about how you write your questions and answers. Make sure they're accurate and not debatable. I think I know what she meant, but it's debatable. So I would not use that question exactly like it was presented, because of that. The right answer may or may not be right. So be careful with your questions, and that would be part of your grade. Would be what kind of questions you ask, whether they're good questions, whether they're stupid questions. I guess that would be another one. If your answers are so obvious, then I start kind of thinking anybody could guess that without even listening. Okay, that the negative or the wrong answers are so stupid that anybody who answers those questions has to be an idiot. So if your questions or your answers to your questions are too obviously untrue, then that makes a bad question too. So make your questions good. They do need to be objective. Last semester I had some students giving essay questions. I don't want essay questions. I want questions that I can be graded by the computer without me having to grade them. So, like I said, I intend to steal some of your questions directly and put into the quizzes and exams. So make good questions for us. I'm not going to use stupid questions. I'm not going to use questions with bad answers. I'm not going to use questions that aren't covering something somewhat important. I'll use the best questions that cover the content, have good answers, and definitely are not essay questions. These are ones that the computer knows how to answer. In your first quiz, you saw, for example, was a multiple choice. Was that in this class? No, it wasn't. It's the other class. Sorry, you didn't. But it's possible to do matching. Excuse me, is what I was going to say. It is possible to do matching questions on Moodle. Certainly, it's possible to do true and false and multiple choice. It's also possible to do short answer. So if it's a very clear short answer, I think I did put in the first quiz blank, essentially everything. Okay, you were supposed to fill in the blank, attribute essentially everything. So that was a one-word answer. I could have, as it turned out, I used a multiple choice, but I could have just drawn the blank and had you type in. There is a way to do short answer and just make you type in attribute essentially everything. So I could have done that as a short answer question if there's a clear one-word answer that everybody's going to get. I do, as I set it up, have to take into account that you might misspell it. So if I'm going to do it not in multiple choice format, if I'm going to do it and type in the right answer, I might spell attribute with one T, attribute with no E at the end. I'd have to think of what answers I would accept that were misspelled answers, for example. So it only can only count correct those answers that I give it. And so while the word is clear, attribute, how you might spell it, I might have to guess at. Do I penalize you for misspelling attribute? I have to decide that. Okay. Any questions on presentations? If not, I will close that. I want to go over just a little bit more some of the items in the news writing critique sheet. I did make some changes in it from your history class, and I didn't have time to go over that very clearly in the lecture on Monday, so I want to go over just a little bit more here. I think lead writing was fairly clear. I did put a speech interview example here. Again, that was in, at least for the last history class, I think that was what I had there before. This is an example of a speech interview lead. And again, that is a very common lead. I do it a little bit different than some others would suggest, in that I do put the attribution to the end, because I think that the most important part should go to the front. So you should know how I do it. I also, however, here added a complete lead. So I did a different lead here, and then a second paragraph to show a complete lead that should cover most of the 5 W's. As I mentioned, with a timeless complete lead, you may not mention the when and even the where. If the where is a conference, that suggests a when. So even the where might be hidden. You may not cover the when and where in your lead or any place, anywhere in the story. That said, when you're doing a timeless approach, a magazine approach, let's say I'm doing one on the city council. Go back to the city council example again. I can mention the city councils, that the city council met and the city council voted to raise taxes. That does not automatically make mine a time-sensitive story. If the rest of the story is all in present tense, with present tense attribution verbs and so forth, I can mention that they voted to raise taxes. Now I change it to a issue-oriented story about the pros and cons of higher taxes versus services, taxes versus services, and so it's simply mentioning that as an incident does not tie the entire story necessarily to that city council meeting. The fact that they voted to raise taxes now sets the stage for a discussion of the pros and cons of raising taxes. So now your interviews may or may not have occurred at city council meeting. Your implication is that they did not. You don't have to tell them whether some of the quotes you used were at city council meeting. You just don't have to tell them. But almost certainly some of your quotes won't be from city council, and that's the approach you're taking. We're discussing this issue, and we have several sources giving their opinion as to why the city should or should not raise taxes. And so it benefits then to go to present tense verbs of attribution to make it clear that this did not all take place at the city council meeting. So you have to be careful in how you word it, but you can mention a past event without forcing the entire story to be a time-related story. It can still be timeless, just the fact that they did something. Another example would be the election coming up. You can mention who was elected, and yet your story may be timeless in asking people the pros and cons. How do you think this new prime minister is going to do? What? And so now the comments you're getting from people, that yes, it obviously, if you had a new prime minister related to the election, but not directly. That's not the essence of your story. Your story is not about the election. It mentions the election. Your story is an issue-oriented story about the pros and cons of what people expect from the new prime minister or new president or whoever you're writing about. And indeed, that may still have news value even months from now to some people. If you make it in a timeless fashion, for example, people are still trying to figure out what kind of president Trump is. They still don't know. Is he going to start World War III or is he going to win the Nobel Prize for peace? Nobody's quite sure. And we're over a year into his presidency, and he's kind of erratic sometimes. So we don't even know, is he going to cause a war or is he going to cause world peace? We don't know. He seems to be doing pretty well right now with North Korea after making statements that sounded like he was ready to go to war. Now suddenly they're kissing and making up. So even a year after somebody's elected, the discussion on what they're going to be like as the president or prime minister or whatever position they're in may still be newsworthy. So if somebody reads your story a year from now, it may still be newsworthy. You're taking an angle that has a timeless element to it. Some stories will date themselves quicker than others, even if they're written in a timeless way, like a magazine article, they will still date themselves eventually. Eventually, they probably will be not interesting to anybody. But it may take a while. It could be, like I say, a year from now before an analysis of Donald Trump becomes old news because we still don't know what he is. He could still start World War III, or he could cause greater peace than we've ever known. We don't know. Attribution, again with this, these are real news sources. These are not made up. In fact, at the bottom, it shows that you need to give me your news source by name, their phone number, and their email address. So you need to be collecting that information to put it at the bottom of your story. I have the option of calling them if I feel like I need to verify that they really were interviewed by you. Obviously, I can't call every news source that all 95 students uses in their stories. But if there's something in there, in fact, that's kind of, it wasn't really discussed in today's, but an editor who's doing holistic editing, the first presentation was about micro editing. It was kind of presented more like from the reporter's perspective, but it's about editing. The editor has to make sure the reporter did these things, that the reporter did not bias his lead and so forth. So we should be looking at this from an editor's perspective, and it is his responsibility to make sure the reporters don't screw up the story. The content editor will be looking at, again, at bias, at sources, at unanswered questions, that sort of stuff. He's looking for content primarily. Whereas the copy editor is looking more towards the spelling and the grammar, the expression, the flow, how you wrote the lead. It's more of his responsibility, although the content editor may correct some of that stuff too. The content editor, again, would be the metro editor, or whoever the reporters report to directly that oversees their work is the content editor. He's looking for fairness, sources, unanswered questions, all of that stuff. That doesn't totally eliminate the responsibility from the copy editors to do that, but the copy editor is more responsible for the spelling and grammar and style and so forth, the flow, how it's written. In explaining that, we're really talking about daily newspapers, primarily, when we talk about that sort of division of labor. It's actually why I did not enjoy being a daily newspaper editor, was that I did not feel like I felt like I was a little niche, a little cog in a machine. And I enjoyed doing more things. I enjoyed reporting. I enjoyed doing photojournalism. I enjoyed content editing. I enjoyed copy editing. I enjoyed newspaper design. I enjoyed all of it. And as a daily newspaper editor, I was confined to being more copy editor. I also had functions of wire editor and had some other functions. But basically, I was pretty much confined in what I could do because I was part of a big machine. But once you get into smaller organizations, you don't have neither the opportunity nor the responsibility to be very narrow in your coverage. You have to, or in your responsibilities, you have to be bigger. You have to do more things. And that to me is more pleasant, more enjoyable as a journalist, is to do more things. And so I would rather be part of a smaller organization than a bigger one. Just my personal nature. Even though I may talk about content editors versus copy editors, that is typically a daily newspaper differential. That is not normally a weekly newspaper division of labor. It's more of a daily newspaper division of labor, and that's even a bigger newspaper that can afford at least 20 or 30 journalists in their newsroom. Then they can start doing more division of labor and giving specific responsibilities to content editors versus copy editors versus reporters and so forth. Essentially, every paragraph should be attributed. We've talked about that already, and this gives the example of how to handle the second attribution to the same person. You use their whole name in the first attribution and perhaps a title. In the second attribution, typically it's just the last name. There are exceptions to that, but by AP style, by Associated Press style, it's just the last name. So Harvey said in this example. Do use direct quotes. Try to capture as many direct quotes as you can. But ultimately what you want to do is interweave your direct quotes and your indirect quotes. That allows you to steer your story in a smooth, flowing way. You want a mixture of indirect quotes and direct quotes. Even if you transcribe it, and if you could make the entire thing a direct quote, you don't want to do that. Because your indirect quotes or your paraphrases, for our purposes the same thing, are what steers the story. That's what makes it smooth. If you just start putting in direct quote after direct quote after direct quote after direct quote, it has no direction. It can't be a smooth running story unless it's absolutely verbatim. The whole thing is verbatim, then maybe it's smooth. It might be fairly smooth. But that's not even, in an interview, that's not even possible. So maybe in a speech, if it was a speech story, if you just basically gave the whole speech, then that should run pretty smoothly. But of course, that's not how you report. So you might see that in a magazine, but you're not going to see that in a newspaper, and you're not going to see it in many magazines. So that's not newspaper style, not news style to include everything. So in making it run smoothly and having enough direct quotes to keep it interesting, adding a personality to it, adding detail to it that you wouldn't add if you were just telling it in your own words. You want to have a mixture of indirect quotes and direct quotes. The indirect quotes basically guide the story, and the direct quotes give personality and detail to the story, emotion to the story sometimes. Be very specific. And again, I did cover that in history class and other classes you may have been in. Do not, if you ever use the word about, question yourself whether that's necessary. And so the example, the bad example here, the speaker spoke about freedom in America. There's almost no detail in there that's worth having. So instead of saying the speaker spoke about freedom in America, you want to say the speaker says competition of ideas is the key to maintaining freedom in America. Give something specific. That is an indirect quote. It's not a direct quote. It could be a direct quote if you want, if it were verbatim. But the point is that always make sure there's something in essentially every sentence that is newsworthy, that has a reason to be there. And most about sentences have very little reason to be there. So they should be very rare to have an about sentence. And by the way, about sentences don't have to use the word about. I'm just using that as an example that if you use the word about, it will very likely lead you astray. But you can have empty sentences that don't use the word about. So I may say this is an about sentence, and it may not have the word about in it. But what I'm saying is that this is telling what it's about, but it's giving no detail. It's giving no news of interest. So it's still, in my definition, an about sentence. By the way, again, the percentages are different than in the history class. 20% for lead writing, 20% for attribution, 20% for language. So those have all increased a little bit rather than over what was done in the history class. Whereas the content has come down from 50%, I think it was in history, to 30%, so that I could give those points elsewhere. So your style, your lead, your attribution is all worth more now. Under language, some of this we have already talked about. Cut down your wordiness, make things simple, make sure it flows. That's, again, partly of using indirect and direct quotes together to make it flow right. Do your best with the English grammar. If I can understand it, I'll try, I'll take into account that you're not native English speakers, but I can't say that your English won't have any impact on your grade. If I have to struggle to figure out what you're saying, then it's going to have an impact. Remember the rules about writing quotes, both indirect and direct. We did talk about this a little bit on Monday. It talks about the type 1, type 2, and type 3 quotes. Type 1 is the attributions at the beginning, and that's almost always an indirect quote. So type 1 is almost always indirect. There are exceptions to that, and that is particularly if you're like doing a survey type story and you wanted to quote a lot of people, and so you're actually quoting maybe 4 or 5 people right in a row. Maybe they're short quotes, but you're quoting 4 or 5 people because they're part of a survey, and you're trying to reflect on what things the people being surveyed were saying. Then you need to mix up the typology if you have 5 quotes in a row. So you're going to have to change some to type 1 quotes probably to just keep from being confused. Particularly if you have a type 2 or type 3 quote, a direct quote, and then you immediately follow it with another direct quote by somebody else, that's where it's going to be confusing. So that second direct quote, where you have 2 direct quotes right in a row from 2 different people, the second one probably is going to have to be a type 1, just to keep the reader from being confused. So that's basically that's when you would have a type 1 direct quote, is if you have 2 direct quotes in a row. Then you would. Otherwise, you try to avoid that. Type 3. Let me point out something here. Please pay attention to this. Some of you had trouble. Some of you that were in history class and stuff had some trouble with this. Type 3 can be related to the paragraph, not to the sentence. So a type 3 quote can be 1 paragraph with 2 or 3 sentences, and that's going to have different punctuation than if the attribution is dividing one sentence quote. So for example, here the first one is only 1 sentence, but it's still a type 3 because the attribution is in the middle. So it's 1 sentence. So you pay for native advertising, as you said, but it blends in with unpaid content, including some of your own. Okay, so because this is in the middle of a sentence, There's not a period after said, and but is not capitalized, because this is in the middle of the sentence. Down here, however, there's another example where it's providing, it's still type 3, but it's providing two different sentences. So it's type 3 because the attribution is in the middle of the quote, but it's a two-sentence quote. Or a two-sentence quote, whatever. So in this case, native advertising is one reason why on the internet the company would be crazy not to practice integrated marketing communication, IMC, comma, quote mark, Harvey said, period. Okay, so this is different than up here. Up here is a comma. Here's a period. The period says it's starting the sentence. And so be careful, a lot of people make this mistake time after time in history class. This is a comma because in the middle of the sentence, it's the period because it's divided into two different sentences. And so the period, now they capitalize to the it's the new sentence. So don't, so type 3 is not always, does not always have a comma after that. The attribution, whatever it is. It does not always have a comma there. It can be a period there. It depends. Is your attribution splitting one sentence separately, or is it splitting two different sentences? In this case, it's two sentences that have a period and capitalized next letter. In this case, it's splitting one sentence, so it's a comma and a lowercase letter in the next word. So type 3 can be either one. It can divide a long sentence into half, or it can divide a two-sentence quote. In either case, it's type 3. Vary your verbs strategically. That's basically where I'm saying use said or says, depending how you're trying, if you're going magazine style or going news style. If you definitely have a time element, that is, in other words, if your story is about an event, then definitely you need to go past tense. If your story is an issue, then I would recommend present tense. And I would also say in here, again, try not to vary too much from the verb to say. Don't try to use too many synonyms to say. If you look at American newspapers, you will not see even much variation at all. And the readers don't notice it. They don't notice it until you start trying to vary it. That's when they notice it. Content, basically the quality of content, the blending of direct, indirect, and direct quotes, the quality of the sources, all have to do with content. Plagiarism. Obviously, you're going to get a 0 if you plagiarize, but it's important to understand that self-plagiarism is still plagiarism. Now, that's important at a university because some students try to use the same story for multiple classes. That is not allowed, and maybe professors forget to tell you that. That should not be allowed because you should be writing new stuff. You should be doing your coursework or your classwork for another course should be different than what you did for a previous course. Now, could it be the same subject? Yeah, probably, but be careful with that. It's again kind of like borrowing a subject or a topic from another newspaper. Make sure it's your new original work. So if you've written about this subject before, make sure you do it differently this time. However, I would advise you not to use the same subject that you used before. And one reason is that getting hired in many cases will depend on your portfolio. You should, in a field like journalism, you should be building a portfolio. Now that portfolio may include video, so you could include in your portfolio either web links to your video that's on YouTube, or it could include a DVD with your video on it. But you should also have other things, including you should put your desktop publishing products in your portfolio. Some of you say, well, I'm going to definitely be working at a TV station or something like that. Why would I need desktop publishing? And I can tell you that you never know when something will be important. I kind of alluded to it, I think, in my lecture, but when I was teaching at another college, I could take classes free, so I took a class about database creation and management. I had no reason to take that class, that course, except curiosity and just wanting to understand computers better. I didn't feel like I understood computers adequately. I knew the computers were the future, so I started taking some courses that I didn't have a lot of interest in, but I thought might be valuable someday, at least to my understanding of computers. And so I took a course in 1987, something like that, in database. I didn't think I'd ever use it. I did find it kind of boring. 5 years later, when I took my first job in marketing, I used it all the time. It turned out to be one of the most valuable tools I ever had was database. Because database was the beginning, if any of you have studied marketing at all, integrated marketing communication, which I mentioned in this example of here, is the idea of integrating your PR with your advertising, with your sales. Everything gets integrated. All your promotional products, all your marketing products become integrated under one vice president or whatever his title might be. And they try to correlate all that stuff together. But on top of that, they start trying to individualize. So IMC is depending more and more on databases. And how do you communicate with people and know which message to send to each person? And so you start distinguishing even to the point of psychographics. How does a person make their judgment on how to buy something? Is this person somebody who would buy a convertible because they want to be cool and they want to show off to everybody? Or is it somebody who would buy a station wagon because they want to have a family and they want to have plenty of room for all their kids? Some of that has to do with psychographics, not just demographics, but psychographics. How does somebody think? I was talking to one of our journalism students the other day. Would a newspaper in this day and age be able to improve their online product by using better databases? In other words, personalizing what a person saw on their website. So when I come on the website of a newspaper, I would see something different than if you go on that website, because they're doing the same thing that marketers are doing. They're using their databases to track what you like. And so up pops right now, newspapers in America are going broke because they can't get people to transfer over to the online product. But maybe they could if they did the online product better, including individualizing the content. That doesn't mean you don't make available all the content. You probably do, because you have plenty of space online. But what they see on the front page is uniquely yours. It's been individualized for you in the same way that marketers are individualizing the content when you go when you go online. And they're trying to show you exactly what you want to buy, basically. So anyway, my point is that I didn't think database would ever be valuable, and it's turned out to be one of the most valuable tools, not only to me in my career, but right now is one of the most important things going on online is database, is data, big data they call it. And that could even be important in the future, because they're not doing it now. It could and should be important to news organizations. Because if it's good for marketers, it's almost certainly good for news editors if they learn how to use it right. Avoid first-person and second-person references, and do not add personalized conclusions at the bottom. If you want to use a direct quote by somebody else at the bottom to have a sense of a conclusion, do it understanding that the bottom of your story may be cut off, as we talked about on Monday. You don't know what's going to be included in your story. It may get cut off arbitrarily at the very bottom, wherever they run out of space. And so do not put something as a conclusion that you absolutely have to have in the story. It should not be a lead item you're preserving for the conclusion. If you want to have a sense of conclusion, you can use a direct quote down there. Don't make it your own profound thoughts, but make sure it's a direct quote that's not essential to the story. That it's a nice roundup of the story, perhaps, but not essential to the story. Then you can have a sense of conclusion if you want to. I won't penalize that. everybody listen to this, you are responsible for coming up with graphics with your story. That means photographs or other graphics. Every story should have graphics or photographics on it. If you don't have it, you're going to definitely be penalized because our class demands it. If you're going to be doing pages that are not just your story. In fact, they may not have your story at all. It might have your story, it might not have your story on the page you do. I haven't decided exactly how to distribute the stories. You may be using stories in here from a different section. None of the stories might come from any of you that you do when you're doing your desktop publishing. You will find that if you have a story that has no art with it, that you will learn how to create art from scratch, but it's not great art. And so a story without a graphic is probably going to be a one-column story to try to play down the fact that it has no art with it. Because it's with no art, you can't give it very much space on your front page. On your jump page, it won't matter as much, but on your front page, you don't want it there. You want it there if you have to have it on your front page, obviously, but you don't want to play it up. You want to play it way down if it has no heart. Even if it's an important story, you're going to play it down. So you need art, and that's part of your grade. And finally, you don't necessarily have to use inverted pyramid for your stories. So I did leave in here that you use inverted pyramid, but you don't have to. But if you're not going to make it, I should agree with you that it's better not to. Let me put it that way. Some stories, for example, if they have a suspense angle to them, you may find that that you have to go chronological at some point. You're telling a story. Sports stories frequently start with a summary lead, but then they go into a narrative of how the sports event ended up with the final score and who did what, and they go in a chronological order because that makes sense. A crime story could be the same thing. If you're going into detail in a crime story, then you may very well start with a summary with your complete lead, but then you may go into a narrative in the body of your story and go chronological because you're trying to tell exactly what happened in order, and it doesn't make sense to tell that story otherwise. So if you get into that if you get that sort of a story where it only makes sense to do it chronologically, then that's not an inverted pyramid. And so I would not expect an inverted pyramid if you do a good job of telling a story in chronology, because it requires chronology. But if you use chronology and it doesn't require chronology, for example, a speech, if you're covering a speech, the easiest way to cover a speech is chronological, but it's not the best way to cover it, because usually a speaker is building to their conclusion. And so the conclusion of a speaker should be in the lead. A speaker's conclusion is their lead, is your lead as a writer. Their conclusion's your lead. And so very frequently when you're covering a speech, you almost flip the speech on its head and make the conclusion your lead. So it definitely is not chronological. That's the lazy reporter's version of a speech, is to cover it chronologically, and you'd definitely be penalized for that, because that's almost universally not acceptable to cover a speech chronologically. Okay. I expanded, as I mentioned, the example. It's still the same example that I had last time I taught history. But I added some to it, so this is now 700 words long. Your story should be somewhere between 600 and 1,000 words, the story you're going to be producing. I forgot to say something. Let me emphasize it right now. I did send out an announcement, but your minor project 1 is still due by Friday night. So be sure to get your minor project 1 in. I did send out to you, if you are signed up for Moodle, I did send out a notice of that with a PDF of what your minor project 1 should more or less look like. What I included in included in week 1 in the tutorial. I showed you more or less what I was expecting with your minor project 1. Just those slides that I took from the PowerPoint, I made into one item. I put it in on Moodle, and I sent you a copy also under announcements. So minor project 1 is still due on Friday, even though we're pushing back the presentations. That doesn't change anything else. Going through this story, some of the things to point out. One is if you're using bullet items, make sure they're newsworthy. Very frequently, some of you beginners and some of you specifically in the history class use bullet items that had nothing important in them. You didn't give enough information to make the bullet item worth making a bullet item. There was no news in it. So preferably, in most bullet items in a news story, you may have a complete sentence. In fact, in our newspaper, in the daily newspaper, their style was always put a period at the end of each bullet item, even if it's not a complete sentence. Put a period on it anyway. Not all publications agree with that, but I actually kind of thought that was a good idea. So even if it's not a complete sentence, I would say put a period at the end of a bullet item anyway. But that also kind of dictates that it's not a one-word bullet. A one-word bullet, almost by definition, can't have much newsworthy to it. So if you're using bullets in a news story, give enough information that is newsworthy. So in this case, they are, they're complete sentences in the sense that basically there's an assumed you. You focus on individual consumers. You use, well, they're not really complete sentences by themselves, but they have the essence of a complete sentence, each one of these bullet items. So don't use more than one set of bullets in a story, and make sure that they're newsworthy bullets, or don't use bullets at all. I was talking before, and let me kind of cover this again here, you don't have a perfect indirect quote, direct quote, indirect quote, direct quote, indirect quote, direct quote. Now, I'm not expecting that, but it will run smoother if you have something like that. So up here, we have the complete lead, and then I use a direct quote, as I suggested the other day, that reflects the lead, but it's not a direct quote in the bridge. And so the lead was, marketing and PR in the 21st century are undergoing dramatic changes, says David W. Guth, an American public relations expert visiting Malaysia. Now I jump down to the bridge, and it says, with the development of databases and the ability to capture data off the internet, PR and marketing are becoming more individualized. They can hardly be called mass marketing or mass communications anymore, said Guth. So the lead is not exactly, the bridge is not exactly the lead, but it reflects the lead and it gives more detail and more emphasis to what he was explaining. So the lead is quite vague in this case. The bridge brings us back to the same point, but it now gives us more detail. So now the body of the story can start at the same place and now start giving more detail. So in a sense, the lead is the indirect quote that is leading to the quote. Okay, indirect quote, quote. Now we have some more indirect quote. Particularly, this one is kind of some throwaway information. They explain that integrated marketing communications, IMC, and other forms of consumer-focused marketing are uprooting the notion of mass marketing by helping organizations customize their messages to targeted groups and directly communicate with individuals over the internet and with other forms of modern communication. Indirect quote. Direct quote, in the 21st century, marketing means building relationships with individual consumers, and that's good news for public relations. So you are still making some indirect quotes to direct quotes, indirect quotes to direct quotes. Let me jump to the bottom of the story. So here, picking it up again after the bullets. Harvey said that inbound marketing tactics such as offering free games, webinars, and ebooks get people to share their personal information through a registration process. Quote, with increasing focus on building two-way win-win relationships with important publics, modern marketing tools pretty much dictate the use of an integrated marketing approach. Harvey said that what used to be considered public relations has now become central to the entire marketing process. So indirect quote, direct quote, stemming off of that indirect quote. Anyway, so it goes. That's what in this example, I'm trying to show you how to use your indirect quotes and direct quotes together to smoothly run through the story. So I really recommend that if you have any trouble with that you read this model and think about it very carefully, how I'm using the direct quotes and indirect quotes together to build a complete story, make smooth transition from ideas to idea. Because that's what you need to do. Your grade will depend on that. So you want a smoothly written story, and that's how you do it. Okay, I'm going to close that. Oh, down at the bottom, I'm not going to close that. So here are the sources. Also, if you have pictures, if it's clearly just a head and shoulders, you can just say use the name line. Of course, to do that, you need to name your file, your JPEG file, the name of the person. Don't make the name of the JPEG so vague that I don't know who the picture's of. So if it's going to be just a name line, if you're not going to give me a full caption, whichever, you need to make sure I know which picture, who's in which picture. So if the name of the file is guth1.jpg, then I know that this is the caption you prepared for that photo. And that photo probably is more than head and shoulders. Indeed, it says, David Guth, a marketing expert from Los Angeles, meets with a small group of Malaysian business executives following the Xiamen conference to explain how they can better use the internet to tell their story and promote their products and services. So you need a caption kind of like this. By the way, just like headlines, past tense captions use present tense verbs. So David Guth meets with a small group of local business people. So it's similar to headlines in that way. We use something that is past, we use present tense for. In essence, the excuse of the photo is that you're explaining what's happening in the photo. So in this photo, you're not going to say that, but in essence, you're saying in this photo, Dr. Guth meets with, and you're using present tense verb for what's going on in that photo. So that is good for you to know at this point. You'll learn more about captions later, but if you can follow that rule, that would be a feather in your cap and maybe points in your grade book. I want to go over just a couple of thoughts on holistic reporting, which was kind of part of what we're talking about here today. As a holistic editor, you are, I would emphasize kind of this sequence that a holistic editor is going to look at. Now, if it's a big newspaper with both content editors and copy editors, not all of these functions are done by the same editor. If it's a smaller newspaper, all of these functions do have to be done by the same editor. So as a editor of weekly newspapers, I had to take all of these steps that are talked about here. So first off, you need to. Is this where I want to be? Nope, that's not where I want to be. I'm going to go with this one. Okay, so as an editor, the first thing you want to do is read the whole story. I sometimes make exceptions to that, especially if I'm in a hurry and I don't have the luxury of reading the whole story first, then I may be doing some copy editing and stuff along the way. But ideally, you read the whole story to get the whole picture. You want to get the whole idea. What is the story about? And don't start editing it yet. You read the whole story, you get a sense of it. You may maybe highlight some things, like if it's on a computer, which presumably it would be, use a highlight marker and mark the areas that you want to come back and look at again. So you may notice a problem. That doesn't mean you have to fix it right then. And so maybe highlight the problem areas that you can do something about later. But read the whole story so that you can get a full grasp of what it's about. And for example, you don't want to start rewriting the lead until you know that they missed it. And so part of what you're looking for when you read the whole story is what should be the lead. That's a question in your mind. Does this have the right lead? And so you read the whole thing to make sure that you understand everything about it. Then step B is using your fine-tooth comb. That's an English way of saying look at it a lot closer. And so you start fixing. Again, this is if it's a bigger organization, this would be a copy editor function. Start fixing the typos, the punctuation, fix the usage and grammar mistakes, make sure everything follows style. That's really a copy editing function. If I were the Metro editor, if I was the content editor, I might make some of those changes myself. But that's not, if it's a big enough organization and the content editor is going to look at it first, he may not do step B. He may jump over that and leave that to the copy editor, because that is more the copy editor function. So I think they're doing this in the wrong order. The step C that they have in the book is make sure the structure of the text makes sense. Is information in the right order? Does it flow from one idea to the next easily and smoothly? Is everything clearly explained? Are there unanswered questions? Is any information missing? This is the content editor's responsibility. So this should be step C should be step B, because content has to be considered before style and stuff. So if they're separate people, the content editor, the Metro editor, in the case of a mid-sized daily, is going to be doing step C, and only after that will he hand it off to the copy editor to do step B. So I would not have put it in this order. So step, again, I would reverse these, but that's in this presentation it wasn't. So the big picture should be covered by the content editor if he's a separate person. Than the copy editor. And all those questions are things that the content editor, the Metro editor, or whatever, who's in charge of the reporters is going to be looking at. In some cases, he's going to send the story back to the reporters. If the reporter has not answered all the questions, if some of the information is missing, if he hasn't interviewed all the people necessary, the content editor is going to give it back to the reporter and say, go do your job. Because he didn't do it right the first time. And so that's why the content editor has to do step C. He's the one the reporter's answering to, so he has to tell the reporter when he hasn't done his job right. So step C should be step B. Once he's satisfied, whether he's had the reporter get involved again or not, he then hands that off to the copy editor in a larger organization, and then step B takes place, and that's when you start worrying about all the typos. Again, the content editor might fix some of those, but it's not his primary responsibility. That's the copy editor. Typos, punctuation, usage, grammar, and style is all the copy editor's responsibility. Either one of them could rewrite the lead. The last person, I mentioned this other day, the last person to see that story in a large organization is the copy editor. And the copy editor is going to write the headline. He's going to design the page. He's going to put it in the newspaper or whatever publication it is. He has the ultimate last responsibility to make sure this is done right. So the copy editor at that point owns that story. Once the content editor hands it off to him, he owns it. If it goes out and it's done poorly, he's the one that's going to get blamed for it. So the copy editor has to do a good job, and that can include rewriting parts of this story. Even though that probably the content editor should have done some of that. Ultimately, the copy editor is the last one that owns it. He has to fix it if he thinks it's not right. So also the fact checking could be done by either one of them. But ultimately, again, the copy editor is the last one to see the story. So ultimately, it falls on the copy editor's shoulders to make sure that the facts are correct to the degree he can check them. This again is a situation where he may have to get the reporter involved in it again. I mentioned that I may be looking at your stories and ask myself, does this sound like this person really wrote this, or did they get this someplace else? Sometimes that's if it's done too well in a class, but sometimes that's done by they're just subtle hints in how you attribute. If it just does this sound like this writer. Some writers, they have their own style, and if suddenly a writer hands in something that doesn't sound like their style, then you become suspicious. In this day and age, it's not included here, but a number of major newspapers have been embarrassed by reporters who have made up quotes and made up stories, including the Washington Post and New York Times, two of the most the biggest brands in journalism, have been embarrassed by fake news, by truly fake news, fake story, fake quotes. The one that I will show you later in this course was a young African American reporter for the Washington Post, and she did a story about the challenges of a boy in inner city Washington D.C. And she kind of tracked his life about all the challenges he faced and so forth. And she had all these interviews with him and everything. And she made the mistake of winning the Pulitzer Prize, if you call that a mistake. If she had never won the Pulitzer Prize, they would not have found out that she was a liar. But once she won the Pulitzer Prize, Associated Press started looking at her CV, and they realized there were lies in her CV. And so if somebody lies in their CV, they presume this is a liar. This is somebody you cannot trust. And so they started checking other things. And the more they checked, the more lies they found that this reporter was making. And ultimately, because of all the lies that Associated Press found in her background, the editors had to bring her into the office and grill her to find out whether this story was true. And she finally broke down and admitted that she just made up this character, that it was not a real boy. But she tried to argue, well, but there's lots of boys like this. Well, that's still not true. Just because there's lots of little young boys like that growing up in inner city does not make this story true. And so she had made up the boy, made up the quotes, made up the interviews, made up the scenarios. Everything was made up. So obviously she probably never got another job in journalism, even though she was a very good writer and had won the Pulitzer Prize. But once you embarrass the Washington Post by winning a prize with a fake story, there's not a lot of people knocking at your door to give you a new job. Thus, after both the Times and the Washington Post got embarrassed, they both changed their policies to where there was no such thing as a totally anonymous source that only the reporter knew about. Every anonymous source an editor had to know who that anonymous source was. In the case of in this example, he would have had to meet the little boy. Would be the rule that the Washington Post set up thereafter, that little boy whose name was anonymous was not going to be anonymous, not only to the reporter but also to an editor. The editor would have to meet that little boy. And the same rule that the New York Times was embarrassed likewise, and so made up a similar rule that we need to be able to contact the sources. And so that's one reason why I have your sources at the bottom of your story, because in case I start suspecting there's something wrong, I will send an email or make a phone call. So that is kind of part of fact-checking is, does this sound real? And that's hard to tell sometimes. You can be fooled, an editor can be fooled, but he has to be aware of that. Step E is revise. If you find that things are not flowing right, then like I said, you may rewrite a good share of the story. You're the last one to see that story. You own it. Once the copy editor gets it, he owns it. Now that's true also if it's in a smaller publication. If I get a story and I'm acting both as a content editor and the copy editor, I own the story. I can do anything to it I want to. That's my job. That's my responsibility. The reporter has no recourse unless they happen to come in. Probably they won't even see it until I publish it, unless I need them to answer a question. But if they don't like the way I did it, tough luck. I'm the boss. The copy editor is the last person. He owns that story once it gets to him or her. and the story is going to be the way he wants it, or she wants it. The copy editor, this says it may happen, but in modern day, it almost certainly will happen that the copy editor will write the headline. I sometimes ask my reporters to write a headline, mostly to help them think about what the whammy is. If you were writing the headline, what would you think the headline should be? And let them think about that. Some of them, however, get confused and they think the headline, that if they put it in the headline, they don't need it in the lead, and that's totally wrong. So I'm not doing that as much anymore because it seems to confuse writers more than helps them. But the lead, the whammy or the hook should be reflected both in the headline and in the lead, both of them. You need to draw people to the story, and that's your headline. And once you get to the story, you need to, you try to make it not totally redundant. Nonetheless, if it's the hook, it's the hook, and that hook needs to be reflected both. Or if there's more than one hook, maybe you can use one hook for the headline and one for the lead. But you need a hook in the headline, and you need a hook in the lead. And so, very typically, it's the same hook that you're using twice. In the step F, it is writing the headline, the headers, the subtitles, the captions. Sometimes they have summary sentences now instead of subtitles or subheadlines at the start. We'll talk about all that later. But ultimately, you may get somebody else, particularly captions. The first version of the caption may be written by whoever took the photo. Should be written by whoever took the photo. But ultimately, the editor is responsible for the caption. Sometimes called a cut line, by the way. Caption, cut line, same thing. And so he's responsible for making sure that it's in the right style. Some photographers or some photos are taken by photographers who don't understand how to write a caption, but they still need to give you the information. It is ultimately the editor's responsibility to make sure the caption is written well and in proper style. Beyond that, there are all sorts of pieces that show up in a paper. You can have historical pieces, you can have political pieces, economic pieces, feature stories. The main thing I say, this chapter does cover a lot of different possible topics that you as an editor might have to cover. Some of them have their own unique problems. You have to understand how they might be different and how they might be the same. You still need a good lead, you still need a good headline. But as I mentioned earlier, it may be that a crime story ends up having a summary lead, complete lead, and then goes into a chronology. Same thing for a sports story. Start off with a summary, complete lead, go into a chronology, because those stories may encourage you to do that. Now, not all crime stories go chronological, but if you want to have a sense of suspense, then you're probably going to go chronological. And if it's in depth, if it's worthy of going in depth, then it's probably going to be chronological, or at least very possibly. Political stories, be careful with them. This is particularly one of the greatest investigative reporters of all time was a guy named Jack Anderson. And one of his perspectives was, don't trust paid sources, because almost by definition they're going to lie to you. And so his formula was, usually, he said, most reporters make the mistake of thinking you can get half the story from one source and half the story from another source, and you have a complete story. He said that actually is not an additive process; it's a multiplication process. If you get basically half a lie from one source and half a lie from another source, then basically, I guess he said the other way, half a truth from one, half a truth from another, then only you multiply them together and you have 1/4 of the truth. So it's multiplication instead of addition. As an editor, you have to be careful of that your sources are good sources. The more official they are, the more likely they're lying to you. And so a lot of, when you don't have time to do investigative reporting, then basically you're quoting lies. In political stories. You're just quoting lies. And you might as well realize that. So as an editor, you have to try to get them past that if you can. Try to get to the truth if you can, and that is not always possible in politics. Other topics are also sometimes difficult, but of all stories, it's hard to get half one side and half to the other side and get the truth. It's politics. Economics. The Wall Street Journal is probably one of the most famous of the world's economic and business newspapers. And they have a formula for writing a story in a story about that has lots of statistics in it in a way that people will read it. And what they do is that they start the story with an anecdote or a narrative of a person who exemplifies the statistics. So, for example, if the statistics you're covering, if your story is about a new report about unemployment in your country, that makes a very boring lead and won't draw a lot of people into it. So they suggest that you start your story with an anecdote about somebody who's unemployed and the challenges that he had in finding a job, or is still having in finding a job. And then you go to the statistic that things are getting worse, or maybe they're getting better, or whatever. So you go from an anecdote to the statistics rather than starting with statistics that are innately boring. So that's kind of a formula that the Wall Street Journal has created, and it's a good idea for you to think about. If you're covering something that has lots of statistics, and again is innately boring, then think about the Wall Street Journal approach. But we're out of time. I see we're way past. I should have let you go already. I wanted to cover that also. Cover that there's different ways, even though the lead writing is somewhat similar and so forth. Once you get past the lead, the type of story you have will shape what it turns out to be, and it may vary from topic to topic, and an editor may face lots of different topics that they have to deal with. So be prepared for that. Any questions? Anything I forgot to mention? So by Friday night, you want your minor project 1 uploaded. You'll upload it to Moodle. There is a link for you to upload to. I also put in under week 2, again, those slides that related to what information you should include with your story ideas. So that's right there above the link. So you can review that again if you need to. So if there's no questions, we'll end there. Any questions? Nobody wants to raise their hand, and then they come up here and ask me all sorts of questions. Other people have the same questions you have, so ask me the question so I can answer for everybody. Questions, please. Yes? What you're going to hand me, you don't necessarily have to combine them. You can send me the picture, and as long as the name of the caption, the name of the picture matches your caption, I don't need to have them together. So what you give me it's probably better to upload them separately when we get to the real story. So I will need to remember to let you upload more than one file, because typically if you put it into a Word file, you lose some quality. So I'd rather have you upload your photos, in fact, more than 2 files. I may put 10 file possibilities, whatever. I would rather have it in a TIFF file, not a JPEG, but a TIFF file is better quality than a JPEG. And is for desktop publishing, TIFF is fine. It's not fine for websites, it's fine for desktop publishing, and it's fine in converting it to PDF, which can go online. That's all. TIFF is better than JPEG. So I'd rather you give me a TIFF of good quality and upload that separately from the story. But then name your TIFF something that matches with your caption. So your caption will be typed underneath your story, matching the name of the TIFF file that you upload separately. Okay? Good. Thanks for the question. And again, that reminds me that I need to let you, I think I'll max it out at 10. Even though you may take 50 photos, I don't want to see all your 50 photos. If you want to upload 9 photos plus your story, okay, you can give me 9 photos if you want to. It's probably more than I need. You need to use some judgment on which photos you think I should use. But I don't mind you giving me a few extras, because I may disagree with you. So if you think there's any chance I'll disagree with your selection of photos, go ahead and upload 9 photos. That's okay. So I will let you upload up to 10 files. When it comes to uploading your final story, your major project 1, I will allow you to upload as many as 10 files, which would be your story plus 9 photos and 9 graphics. Up to that. You don't have to, but I will accept that many if you, because, like I said, the graphics are so important when you get to desktop publishing. So if you have any question, if you think this one's better than that one, go ahead and let the editor. I will pass those photos. In fact, this is a good exercise for you. I will pass all 9 photos to the editor that's going to do that page and make them decide which is the best one. And then I'll judge them and their choice. So I don't mind having 9 photos so that the editor can choose from among them. That'll be fine. In a real newspaper, the photo editor might bring you a contact sheet with a lot of photos on it and just show you what their contact sheets have photos that big so that you kind of get an idea of all the photos he has available and you tell him which ones you would like to see in full size. So sometimes they do it that way. Or, of course, in this day and age, they may just send you all of them electronically and let you tell them which one you want anyway. So in the old days, they do it with a contact sheet. So they just bring it to you, show it to you physically, and you'd circle the ones you wanted. Yeah, go ahead and print these out. So anyway, things have changed, though. Okay, any other questions? Again, if you have a question, other people probably have the same question. So don't hesitate to ask.